on the corner of 5th Avenue and 128th Street in the heart of Harlem, stood a 4-story mansion built of brownstone. For decades, its windows remained boarded up, its doors sealed from within. The bushes in the front garden grew unchecked until they concealed the facade, forming a vegetable barrier separating the house from the rest of the world. Vines climbed the brick walls, covering the window frames, hiding what had once been elegant moldings and Victorian ornaments. Neighbors passed by it every day, on their way to work, to church, to the corner store. Some instinctively quickened their pace, not knowing exactly why. Others crossed the street to avoid it, as if the house itself emanated something that repelled passers-by. The neighborhood children called it the haunted house, the ghost house, the house where the crazy people lived. Stories were told about it in schoolyards, stories that grew with each retelling, that added macabre details no one could verify because no one dared get too close. What everyone knew, or thought they knew, was that 2 old men lived there. 2 brothers who never came out during the day, who never received visitors, who never answered when someone knocked on the door. No one remembered the last time they had been seen in broad daylight. No one remembered having a conversation with them. They were spectral presences, rumors more than people, shadows inhabiting a parallel world separated from the rest of Harlem by brick walls and mountains of mystery. From time to time, very rarely, some sleepless neighbor would swear to have seen a silhouette moving behind the tattered curtains in the middle of the night, a hunched figure dragging something heavy, moving with slow and deliberate movements. But no one could confirm it. The darkness behind those windows was too deep, the curtains too thick, the distance between the world of the living and the world of the Collyers too great for any testimony to be reliable. The house had not paid taxes for years. Notices from City Hall accumulated in the mailbox, until the mailbox itself disappeared under a tangle of vegetation. Water and electricity bills had been cut off so long ago that no one remembered exactly when. Municipal officials who occasionally visited the property always found the same thing: doors that would not open, windows that did not respond, a dense silence that seemed to absorb even the traffic noise from 5th Avenue. And yet, something lived within those walls. Something breathed in the darkness. The rats that occasionally emerged from the front garden were proof that there was life inside, even if it was life that fed on decay. The smoke that sometimes rose from a chimney on the coldest nights indicated that someone was lighting fires, that someone was trying to maintain warmth in the midst of that urban mausoleum. The oldest neighbors in the area remembered different times. They remembered when the Collyer mansion had been one of the most elegant in the area, when the family that inhabited it was respected and envied in equal parts. They remembered Dr. Herman Collyer arriving in his carriage with his black doctor's bag, politely greeting passers-by. They remembered Mrs. Susie Collyer, always dressed in fine clothes, always with that air of superiority that characterized families who considered themselves above their neighbors. But those memories belonged to another century, to another world. The Harlem of 1947 was very different from the Harlem of 1900. The wealthy white families who had populated its elegant streets had left decades ago, fleeing to the suburbs as the African-American population grew. The Victorian mansions had become tenement houses, divided into small apartments where entire families crowded into spaces designed for servants. The neighborhood had known the splendor of the Harlem Renaissance and the misery of the Great Depression. It had survived riots and epidemics, world wars and economic crises, and through it all, the house on the corner had remained unchanged, closed, silent, guarding its secrets behind blinded windows and doors that no one opened. March 21st, 1947, was a cold but bright day, one of those late winter days when the sun shines intensely, but the air still cuts the skin. Spring was approaching, though it would still be weeks before the trees began to turn green. At 10 in the morning, a man called the district police station. His voice sounded nervous, hesitant, as if he was not sure he was doing the right thing. He said his name was Charles Smith, though that name would turn out to be false. He said he was a concerned neighbor, someone who lived near the Collyer mansion, and who could no longer ignore what his senses were telling him. There was a smell, he explained, a smell that had been emanating from the corner house for weeks, a smell that was becoming more intense with each passing day, a smell that was now impossible to ignore, even from the sidewalk across the street. It was the kind of smell you do not forget, the kind of smell that clings to memory like a stain that no detergent can remove. It was the smell of death. The police operator took note of the call with the routine of someone who had heard hundreds of similar complaints. Harlem was not exactly a quiet neighborhood, and calls about strange smells, suspicious noises, and problematic neighbors were daily bread. But something in the caller's tone, something in the way he described that smell, made the operator mark the call as priority. At 11 in the morning, a police patrol stopped in front of the Collyer mansion. The two officers who got out of the vehicle, William Barker and John Collins, and had been patrolling the streets of Harlem for years. They had seen everything: murders, suicides, accidents, domestic tragedies of all kinds. But even they stopped for a moment before approaching the house, as if something in its appearance warned them that what they would find inside would not be easy to forget. The facade of the mansion was a monument to neglect. The paint had peeled off decades ago, exposing the brownstone that was now blackened by years of soot and pollution. The first-floor windows were boarded up with rotting wood, and the second and third-floor windows had broken glass, covered from the inside by what appeared to be yellowed newspapers, glued from within. The front garden was a miniature jungle, with bushes that had grown to the second floor, and weeds sprouting from every crack in the pavement. And the smell, God, the smell. Even from the sidewalk, several meters from the front door, it was unmistakable. Sweet and nauseating, penetrating and persistent. The smell of decomposing flesh, mixed with something else, something rancid and musty, that spoke of years of accumulated moisture and rot. Officer Barker climbed the porch steps, pushing aside with his foot the dry branches and wet newspapers that had accumulated there. The front door was solid oak, with a brass knocker that had once been elegant and was now green with patina. He knocked hard 3 times and waited. Silence. He knocked again, this time shouting, "New York Police! Open the door!" Silence. Officer Collins circled the house, looking for another entrance. He found a side door leading to the basement, but it was blocked from inside by what appeared to be a mountain of objects piled against it. The basement windows were similarly obstructed, filled to the frame with newspapers, boxes, and what appeared to be rusty machine parts. He returned to the front, shaking his head. There was no way to enter from any side. The two officers looked at each other, weighing their options. Technically, they did not have a search warrant. There was no evidence that a crime had been committed. There was only a smell, a complaint from an anonymous neighbor, and a house that had shown no signs of normal life for decades. But the smell was too intense, too unmistakable, to ignore. They made a decision. Barker returned to the patrol car and requested backup by radio. He asked for a ladder, tools to force entry, and an ambulance just in case. Then he sat on the hood of the car and waited, looking at the facade of the Collyer mansion, while the March sun cast long shadows on Fifth Avenue. He could not know it then, but he was about to discover one of the strangest and most disturbing cases in the history of New York. Half an hour later, the street in front of the Collyer mansion had become a spectacle. 3 patrol cars, an ambulance, a fire truck with a ladder, and a growing crowd of onlookers who gathered behind the barriers the police had improvised with ropes and sawhorses. Neighbors came out of their houses, attracted by the commotion, pointing at the mansion and murmuring among themselves. Many shared stories about the Collyer Brothers, stories that had circulated through the neighborhood for years, but that now, in light of the police intervention, took on a different, more ominous tone. "I have not seen them in years," said an elderly woman who lived across the street. "They used to come out at night, one of them. The younger one, I think. He would drag a cart down the street, collecting garbage from the dumpsters. But I have not seen him in months. Maybe a year, I do not know. My mother used to tell me they were rich people," added a middle-aged man, "that the father was a doctor, and that they had servants and everything. But that was a long time ago, before I was even born." "I always said there was something wrong with that house," interjected another neighbor. "The smell. We have been smelling it for weeks. We thought it was a dead rat or something, but this is something else." While the neighbors speculated, a team of firefighters had deployed a ladder against the building facade. A young firefighter named Patrick O'Brien began climbing toward a second-floor window that seemed less obstructed than the others. The crowd held its breath as O'Brien reached the window and began wrestling with the frame. Years of moisture and neglect had swollen the wood, sealing the window as effectively as any lock. The firefighter had to use a crowbar to open it, tearing off splinters and glass fragments in the process. Finally, the window gave way. O'Brien stuck his head inside and for a moment said nothing. Then he pulled back abruptly, almost losing his balance on the ladder, and vomited on his own shoulder. From below, the other officers shouted, asking what he had seen. O'Brien took several seconds to compose himself. When he did, his voice sounded different, more somber, devoid of the bravado he had shown before. "It is full," he said. "Full of I do not know what. Newspapers, boxes, furniture. It is all full to the ceiling. There is no way to walk. And the smell, my God, the smell." Another firefighter climbed up to relieve him. Then a police officer. One after another, men entered through the window and emerged minutes later with expressions of disbelief and nausea. What they found inside defied all description. The room to which the window led had been at some point in the distant past a bedroom. You could still make out the remains of a bed under mountains of stacked newspapers. A mahogany wardrobe peeked out from one corner, its doors open, revealing more newspapers, more boxes, more objects accumulated without apparent order. But that was just the beginning. Each step inward revealed more accumulation, more chaos. More madness materialized in the form of objects. The hallways had become narrow tunnels between walls of garbage that rose to the ceiling. The rooms were caverns excavated in mountains of possessions. The stairs were blocked by piles of furniture, bicycles, sewing machines, car parts, and the traps. As the men advanced, they began to discover the traps that someone had set throughout the house. Wires at ankle height connected to piles of newspapers that would collapse on anyone who tripped them. Boards balanced precariously on piles of debris, ready to fall at the slightest contact. Passages that seemed safe, but ended in dead ends, forcing retreat by the same path. Whoever had designed that system had thought of everything. He had turned his house into a fortress, a defensive labyrinth designed to confuse, trap, and possibly kill any intruder. It was the work of a paranoid, obsessive mind, completely disconnected from reality. It took them hours to reach the place where Homer Collyer lay dead. They found him on the first floor, in what had once been the main living room. He was sitting in an old armchair, upholstered in red velvet, now worn and stained by years of use. He was wearing a faded blue bathrobe, open over a gray pajama that hung from his emaciated body. His hands rested on the arms of the chair, with fingers curved like arthritic claws. His head was tilted to one side, eyes closed, mouth slightly open. He was dead. He had been dead for weeks, possibly months. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition, which explained the smell that had alerted the neighbors. The skin had darkened and sunken over the bones. The hair, long and gray, fell in strands over the shoulders. The nails had continued to grow after death, or so it seemed, forming yellowish curves at the tips of the fingers. The medical examiner who examined the body that same afternoon would determine that Homer Collyer had died of starvation, combined with cardiac arrest. He was 75 years old, blind, paralyzed by arthritis, and had probably not eaten for weeks before his death. His body, which in life had weighed about 180 pounds, did not reach 90 when they found him. But that was not all. As they removed Homer's body and began cataloging the contents of the house, investigators began asking themselves an increasingly urgent question. Where was his brother? The police had assumed they would find Langley Collyer somewhere in the house, probably also dead, probably in similar condition to Homer. But as the hours passed and search teams combed every accessible corner of the mansion, Langley did not appear. They checked the basement, making their way through mountains of coal and firewood that someone had accumulated there for decades. They checked the attic, where they found more newspapers, more broken furniture, more rusted bicycles. They checked every room, every closet, every space that a human being could occupy. Nothing. Langley Collyer had vanished. To understand how the Collyer brothers reached that point, we must go back almost a century, to the New York of the Gilded Age, when the city was being transformed by men of fortune, who erected mansions as testimonies to their success and ambition. Herman Livingston Collyer was born in 1857 into a well-to-do middle-class family. His father was a merchant, his mother a housewife, and from an early age he showed an inclination toward medicine that his parents enthusiastically encouraged. He studied at Columbia University, graduated with honors, and established a gynecological practice that soon became one of the most prestigious in Manhattan. Dr. Collyer attended to the wealthiest families in the city. He delivered babies in Fifth Avenue mansions, in Park Avenue residences, in Long Island estates. His fees were high, his reputation impeccable, his position in New York society assured. In 1881, Herman Collyer met Susie Gage Frost at a reception given by one of his most distinguished patients. Susie was a woman of conventional beauty but impressive lineage. She could trace her genealogy back to the passengers of the Mayflower, those pilgrims who had arrived in America in 1620, fleeing religious persecution. In a society obsessed with origins, with the purity of American blood, Susie Frost was an extraordinary match. They married in 1882 in a ceremony held at Trinity Church, with the cream of New York society as witnesses. The bride wore a white silk dress imported from Paris. The groom wore a tailcoat made by the best tailor in the city. The newspapers of the time devoted entire columns to describing the elegance of the event, the illustrious names of the guests, the brilliant prospects of the young couple. On November 3, 1883, Homer Lusk Collyer was born, the first son of the marriage. It was a difficult birth, attended by Herman Collyer himself with the help of a colleague, and Susie took months to fully recover. The doctors warned her that another pregnancy could be dangerous, but she did not listen. She wanted more children. She wanted a large family, like those she saw in the society pages of the newspapers. Langley Wakeman Collyer was born on October 3, 1885, 2 years after his brother. The birth was easier this time, but the aftermath left Susie unable to have more children. Those 2 boys would be the only ones, the heirs to a fortune that seemed destined to grow indefinitely. The Collyer brothers grew up in an atmosphere of absolute privilege. The family moved to the mansion on 128th Street, when Homer was 5 and Langley was 3. It was one of the most elegant houses in the area, with 4 floors of brownstone, high ceilings, ornate moldings, and a back garden that extended to the next street. And they had governesses who taught them French and German, tutors who prepared them for the best universities, servants who attended to their every whim. They summered in Newport, spent Christmases with relatives in Boston, traveled to Europe every few years to absorb the culture of the old world. But despite all that privilege, or perhaps because of it, the Collyer brothers never learned to relate normally to the outside world. Susie Collyer was, by all surviving accounts, a woman of difficult character. She was possessive of her children to the point of obsession. She kept them away from other children in the neighborhood, convinced they were a bad influence. She constantly monitored them, controlling every aspect of their lives, from what they ate to what they read, from the clothes they wore to the thoughts they expressed. She was also deeply suspicious. She distrusted the servants, whom she regularly accused of stealing small objects. She distrusted the neighbors, whom she believed were envious of her social position. She distrusted the merchants, whom she accused of overcharging her. She distrusted, in short, anyone who did not belong to her intimate family circle. This distrust was transmitted to her children as a poisoned inheritance. Homer and Langley grew up believing that the outside world was a hostile place, full of people who only wanted to take advantage of them. They learned to distrust strangers, to avoid relationships outside the family nucleus, to consider their home the only safe refuge in a threatening universe. Herman Collyer, meanwhile, was distancing himself more and more from his family. His medical practice kept him busy for long hours, and when he returned home, he found an atmosphere dominated by his wife and her peculiarities. Gradually, he began to spend more and more time away from home, sleeping at the hospital or at some acquaintance's apartment, until finally, at some point in the first decade of the 20th century, he moved out permanently. The marriage never formally divorced. That would have been an unforgivable scandal in that era and in that social circle. But Herman and Susie stopped living together, stopped seeing each other except on formal occasions, stopped functioning as a couple in any meaningful sense. The children stayed with the mother. It was expected. It was natural. It was what the society of the time considered appropriate. No one asked Homer or Langley what they preferred. No one considered that 2 boys entering adolescence might need the presence of their father. It was simply assumed that Susie would take care of them, as she always had. And Susie took care of them. In her own way. Despite the dysfunctional environment in which they grew up, Homer and Langley Collyer received an excellent education. Both attended prestigious private schools, where they stood out for their intelligence and dedication to their studies. Both entered Columbia University, following in their father's footsteps. Homer studied admiralty law, a specialty that at the time promised great opportunities due to expanding transatlantic trade. He graduated with honors and began working at a Wall Street firm that represented some of the most important shipping companies in the country. His colleagues described him as a brilliant but reserved man, capable of analyzing complicated contracts with surgical precision, but unable to maintain a trivial conversation for more than a few minutes. Langley, for his part, leaned toward science. He studied mechanical engineering and chemistry, fascinated by how machines worked and the properties of materials. He also had a talent for music. He played the piano with considerable skill, and for a time considered pursuing it professionally. But family pressures pushed him toward a more respectable career, and he ended up working as an engineer at several companies in the city. The 2 brothers also shared a passion for reading. They devoured books of all kinds, novels, philosophical essays, scientific treatises, historical works. The library in the Collyer mansion came to contain thousands of volumes, many of them valuable first editions that Herman Collyer had accumulated over the years. But despite their academic and professional achievements, neither brother managed to establish significant relationships outside the family home. Homer had some girlfriends during his youth, but no relationship lasted more than a few months. Langley, by all indications, never showed romantic interest in anyone. They lived with their mother, worked during the day, and returned every night to the mansion on 128th Street. Their social lives were limited to professional obligations and occasional visits from distant relatives. They had no close friends. They did not belong to clubs or associations. They did not participate in community life. They were, in the most literal sense of the word, hermits in the middle of one of the busiest cities in the world. The 20th century brought changes that shook the foundations of the world. The Collyers knew. World War I broke out in 1914, and although the United States did not enter the conflict until 1917, its effects were felt throughout the country. The economy fluctuated violently, fortunes were made and lost overnight, and the certainties that had defined upper-class American life began to crumble. Homer Collyer was called up for military service, but was declared unfit due to vision problems that were already beginning to manifest. Langley, for reasons that are not clear in the historical records, also avoided military service. While thousands of young Americans crossed the Atlantic to fight in the trenches of France, the Collyer brothers remained in their Harlem mansion, oblivious to the cataclysm that was transforming the world. After the war came the 20s, the decade of jazz, prohibition, and an economic boom that seemed to have no end. New York became the capital of the world, a frenetic metropolis where everything seemed possible, and nothing was forbidden except alcohol, and not even that if you knew where to look. But the Collyers did not participate in the party. For them, the 20s were a time of withdrawal, of increasing isolation, of gradual separation from the world that was changing around them. Harlem, the neighborhood where they had grown up, was undergoing a radical transformation. The upper-class white families who had populated its elegant streets were moving to the suburbs, fleeing what they perceived as an invasion, the massive arrival of African Americans from the South, attracted by the job opportunities of the industrial North. The Great Migration, as this demographic movement would later be called, changed Harlem forever. Victorian mansions became tenement houses. Exclusive clubs closed their doors to be replaced by jazz bars and dance halls. Streets that had once been the domain of families like the Collyers, filled with music, color, and a new energy that the old residents did not understand and often feared. The Collyers stayed. While their white neighbors fled, they remained in the mansion on 128th Street, increasingly isolated, increasingly out of place in a neighborhood they no longer recognized. Why did they stay? The reasons were probably multiple. Susie Collyer, already elderly and increasingly eccentric, refused to abandon the house where she had lived for decades. Selling the property would have meant admitting a decline in her social position that her pride could not accept. And perhaps there was also an element of defiance in her decision, a refusal to be driven out by the demographic change that was transforming the neighborhood. Homer and Langley, for their part, simply obeyed. Despite being adults, established professionals, middle-aged men with their own careers, they remained in many ways the obedient children Susie had raised. If their mother said they were staying, they stayed. If their mother said the outside world was dangerous, the outside world was dangerous. The lessons of distrust they had learned in childhood continued to determine their lives. In 1929, two events definitively transformed the fate of the Collyer brothers. The first was the death of Susie Collyer in March of that year. She was 84 years old and had been bedridden for months, suffering from a combination of illnesses that doctors of the time could not diagnose precisely. Homer and Langley cared for her until the end, taking turns watching over her sleep, feeding her when she could no longer bring the spoon to her mouth, holding her hand when the pain became unbearable. Susie's death left the brothers orphaned in more than a biological sense. They had lost the center of gravity around which they had orbited all their lives. Without her, they did not know how to function. Without her instructions, her prohibitions, her fears, they were lost. The second event occurred in October of that same year, the stock market crash that marked the beginning of the Great Depression. The Collyers were not immensely wealthy, but they had investments. Stocks that Herman Collyer had accumulated throughout his career, bonds that Susie had inherited from her family, properties whose value seemed destined to grow indefinitely. In a matter of weeks, all of that lost most of its value. What had been a modest but sufficient fortune became almost nothing. Homer lost his job at the law firm, a victim of the cuts that affected the entire financial sector. Langley had stopped working years earlier to care for his mother, and now, at 44, he found himself without recent experience, without professional contacts, without any of the tools necessary to find employment in the middle of the worst economic crisis in American history. The Collyer brothers, raised in privilege, accustomed to money simply being there when they needed it, suddenly found themselves facing a reality for which they were not prepared. Their response was, in retrospect, the only one they knew how to give. They shut themselves in. The 1930s witnessed the gradual transformation of the Collyer mansion, from an elegant residence into a fortress of isolation. The process was slow at first. The brothers began cutting expenses, dismissing the few remaining servants, canceling subscriptions to newspapers and magazines, no longer buying new clothes. They sold some of the most valuable possessions in the house, paintings and antiques that their father had collected, to pay the most urgent bills. But as the months passed, something deeper began to change. It was not just that they could not afford certain things. They had decided they did not need them. The outside world, with its demands and dangers, could stay outside. They would live inside with what they had, without depending on anyone. Langley developed a philosophy of self-sufficiency that bordered on delusion. He believed they could produce everything they needed without leaving home. He installed an oil press in the basement to make his own lamp fuel. He dug a well to get water when the municipal company cut off the supply for non-payment. He studied ancient medical treatises, convinced he could cure any illness with natural remedies. And he began to accumulate. At first it was things that seemed to make sense. Newspapers, which he saved to read later, or to use as insulation in the windows during winter. Books, which he added to the already voluminous family library. Tools, which might be useful for future repairs. But soon the accumulation lost any appearance of rationality. Langley began bringing home objects he found on the streets of New York. Broken furniture, wheelless bicycles, machine parts whose function was impossible to determine. He rescued things from garbage cans, from sidewalks where others had abandoned them, from vacant lots where the city's waste accumulated. Every object had, in his mind, a potential purpose. Every piece of junk could be useful someday. Throwing anything away was an unforgivable waste in a world where resources were scarce and the future uncertain. Homer, meanwhile, was sinking into a physical deterioration that no one intervened to stop. His vision had worsened dramatically since the 20s. What had begun as progressive myopia had become something more serious. Retinal hemorrhages that doctors of the time attributed to untreated hypertension. He saw less and less, depended more and more on his brother to orient himself inside his own house. By the mid-30s, Homer was practically blind. He could distinguish lights and shadows, blurry silhouettes moving in the gloom, but nothing more. Reading, which had been one of his great passions, became impossible. Walking without help, dangerous. Leaving the house, unthinkable. Langley assumed the role of caregiver with a dedication that, seen from outside, might seem admirable. He became his brother's eyes, describing to Homer the world he could no longer see. He became his legs, guiding him through the increasingly narrow corridors of the mansion. He became his only link with external reality, a link that Langley controlled absolutely. But Langley's care had a dark side. He distrusted modern medicine as much as everything else that came from the outside world. When doctors recommended an operation to stop the deterioration of Homer's sight, Langley refused. When they suggested treatments for the arthritis that was beginning to paralyze his brother's joints, Langley said he would take care of it with his own methods. Those methods consisted mainly of oranges. Langley had read somewhere in a book that vitamin C had almost miraculous healing properties. He convinced Homer that a diet based on oranges, 100 oranges a week according to some accounts, would reverse his blindness and restore his mobility. It was, of course, madness without any scientific basis. But Homer was too weak, too dependent, too isolated from the world to question his brother. So the years passed. Homer, increasingly blind, increasingly paralyzed, sitting in his red velvet armchair, while the world collapsed around him. Langley, increasingly paranoid, increasingly obsessed with accumulating, building a labyrinth of garbage that would eventually become the tomb of both. World War II came and went, without the Collyer brothers barely noticing. Pearl Harbor, D-Day, Hiroshima, events that shook the entire world, were for them distant rumors, news filtered through Langley's madness. After the war, when New York was exploding with energy and optimism, when soldiers were coming home and factories were converting to produce consumer goods, when everything seemed possible in a world that had defeated fascism, the Collyer brothers remained locked in their mansion, accumulating newspapers that no one would read, preparing for an apocalypse that existed only in their minds. The authorities intervened on several occasions during those years, but never effectively. In 1942, city officials visited the property to demand payment of back taxes. They found what everyone who approached the house found: closed doors, boarded windows, silence. They left notices that no one collected. They threatened to seize the property. Finally, somehow that was never clear, Langley appeared at the municipal offices and paid the debt in cash, pulling the bills from a pocket of his tattered coat. The electric company cut off service for non-payment at some point in the 30s. Langley responded by installing kerosene lamps and accumulating enough candles to light a church. When they cut off the gas, he had already stopped using it long ago, preferring his own wood stove. When they cut off the water, he dug a well. Each disconnection was, for him, a victory, more proof that he could live without depending on anyone. Neighbors called the police regularly. They complained about the rats that came out of the Collyer property and invaded their own homes. They complained about the ruinous state of the facade, which disfigured the neighborhood. They complained about strange smells emanating from the house, especially in summer. The police would come, knock on the door, receive silence in response, and leave. And there was no law that forced the Collyer brothers to open their house. There was no obvious crime that justified forcing entry. They were two adult men living on their private property. If they wanted to live among garbage, it was their right. That was the reasoning of the era. That was the limit of what society was willing to do for two people who were clearly destroying themselves. The local press had published some articles about the Collyer brothers over the years. They called them the Hermits of Harlem, the Mystery Brothers, the Ghosts of 128th Street. They were an urban curiosity, a local legend, the kind of story that young journalists used to fill space in weekend editions. But no one really took their situation seriously. No one considered that two educated men from good families could be in mortal danger inside their own home. Madness was something that happened to others, to poor people, to immigrants, to those who had not had the advantages the Collyers had enjoyed. It was easier to treat them as an eccentricity than as a developing tragedy. The last years of the Collyer brothers passed in almost total darkness, in an isolation that was no longer voluntary, but had become a prison from which there was no escape. The house by then was practically uninhabitable by any normal standard. The mountains of accumulated objects had grown to occupy almost all available space. The hallways had become tunnels so narrow that only Langley, with his intimate knowledge of the labyrinth, could navigate them without getting stuck. Homer did not move from the armchair where he spent his days and nights. He was completely blind, completely paralyzed by arthritis, completely dependent on his brother for everything. Langley brought him food, oranges, always oranges, along with stale bread and water from the basement well. He changed his clothes when they got dirty, helped him with his physiological needs, read aloud the newspapers he had been saving for decades. Because that was the justification Langley gave himself for continuing to accumulate newspapers. When Homer recovered his sight, he wanted him to have reading material. He wanted him to be able to catch up on all the news he had missed during the years of blindness. Thousands of newspapers piled to the ceiling, decades of news about wars and elections and natural disasters, all waiting for Homer to see again. It was madness, of course. Homer was never going to recover his sight. The doctors had said so clearly before Langley stopped consulting them. But Langley could not, or would not, accept it. In his deteriorated mind, his brother's cure was always possible, always imminent, always about to happen, if only they followed the right regimen of oranges and readings and isolation from the toxic outside world. The nights were for expeditions. Langley left the house only after midnight, when the streets of Harlem were empty except for drunks and insomniacs. He dragged a wooden cart that he had built himself, with wheels salvaged from an old bicycle and a crate as a container. He roamed the alleys looking for treasures among the garbage. More newspapers, more books, more objects that others had discarded but that he saw as valuable. A broken mannequin from a closed clothing store. A car engine that someone had left next to a dumpster. A church organ that he found dismantled on a vacant lot. Everything he dragged back to the mansion, where he added it to the growing mountains of his possessions. There was no criteria, no organization, no discernible purpose. Only the irrepressible compulsion to accumulate, to fill every empty space, to build ever higher barriers between himself and the outside world. The neighbors who saw him pass during those night expeditions described him as a specter. He had thinned to emaciation, his body consumed by a deficient diet and by the physical effort of maintaining his empire of garbage. His long gray hair hung in dirty strands over his face. His clothes were in tatters, outspatched so many times that the original fabric could barely be recognized. His eyes, sunken in their sockets, shone with an intensity that frightened those who crossed his path. He did not talk to anyone. He did not respond to greetings from the few who dared to speak to him. He simply dragged his cart through the dark streets, disappearing before dawn, like a vampire afraid of sunlight. What thoughts crossed Langley's mind during those solitary nights? What conversations did he have with himself as he wandered through the streets of a neighborhood he barely recognized? Did he really believe he was doing the right thing? That he was taking care of his brother? That he was protecting him from the cruel world that had abandoned them? There is no way to know. The answers to those questions died with him, buried under tons of yellowed newspapers. At some point in early 1947, probably in January or February, Homer Collyer died. No one knows exactly when it happened. No one knows what his last words were, if he said any. No one knows whether he died in his sleep peacefully, or whether he suffered for hours or days before his heart finally stopped. What the forensic experts would determine weeks later was that he had died of starvation, combined with cardiac arrest. His body, weakened by years of malnutrition, had simply stopped functioning. He was 75 years old, blind, paralyzed, and had not eaten properly for so long that his organs had begun to fail, one after another. But when Homer died, Langley did not call anyone. He did not dial the emergency number. He did not go out looking for help, and he did not contact the authorities or the few distant relatives who were still alive. He simply left his brother's body where it was. Why? This is the question that has obsessed psychologists, historians, and students of human behavior since the truth of what had happened in the Collyer mansion was discovered. The theories are multiple and probably all contain some truth. The first and most compassionate is denial. Langley had dedicated his life to caring for Homer, to protecting him, to keeping him alive against all odds. Accepting that Homer had died would have meant accepting the failure of everything he had done for decades. In his deteriorated mind, it was easier to pretend that nothing had happened, that Homer was simply sleeping, that he would wake up at any moment asking for his oranges. The second theory points to fear, as the Collyer brothers had spent decades avoiding any contact with the outside world. Calling the police, the funeral services, any authority, would have meant opening the doors of their fortress, exposing their way of life to public scrutiny. Langley, in his paranoia, feared what would happen if someone saw the inside of the house. He feared they would arrest him, that they would lock him in an asylum, that they would take away everything he had accumulated over the years. The third theory is the most disturbing. Perhaps Langley simply did not see anything abnormal in the situation. After decades of extreme isolation, his perception of reality had become so distorted that living with a corpse did not seem fundamentally different from living with a living person who could not move or speak. Homer had been little more than an immobile lump in an armchair for years. That lump ceasing to breathe was a minor, almost imperceptible change in Langley's daily routine. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. Langley continued living in the house for weeks, possibly months, with Homer's body decomposing a few meters away. He continued going out at night to look for more objects for his collection. He continued dragging his cart through the empty streets of Harlem. He continued navigating the garbage tunnels of his domestic labyrinth. And the smell of death began to seep outside. At first it was subtle, barely perceptible, easy to attribute to rats or garbage accumulated in the garden. But as the weeks passed, the smell intensified. It became more penetrating, more sweet, more unmistakably organic. Neighbors began to complain. Calls to the police mentioning strange smells coming from the corner house. Letters to City Hall asking someone to do something about the abandoned property. Rumors circulating through the neighborhood about what might be happening behind those boarded windows. But no one acted. No one wanted to be the first to force entry to a private property. No one wanted to take responsibility for what they might find inside. Until March 21st, 1947. When police finally entered the Collyer mansion and found Homer's body, they assumed the case was solved. A sick old man had died in his home, and his brother had probably also died somewhere in the garbage labyrinth. But as they removed Homer's body and began cataloging the house's contents, Langley did not appear. Search teams worked for days, removing mountains of newspapers, pushing aside broken furniture, making their way through tunnels that collapsed behind them. They found incredible things. 14 grand pianos, a Ford Model T car, disassembled piece by piece, skeletons of cats and dogs that had been trapped in the labyrinth, human organs preserved in formaldehyde jars that had belonged to the father, thousands of empty bottles, rusty antique weapons, machines whose purpose no one could determine. But they did not find Langley. The press, which had arrived en masse to cover the story, speculated wildly. Perhaps Langley had fled before the police entry. Perhaps he was hiding somewhere in the city, watching from afar as they dismantled his life's work. Perhaps he had died years ago, and his body had been devoured by rats. There were reported sightings throughout New York. Someone swore to have seen him in the subway, dragging his characteristic cart. Another witness claimed to have found him rummaging through a garbage container in Brooklyn. The police followed every lead, investigated every rumor. All turned out to be false. The truth was much simpler and much more terrible. On April 9, 1947, 18 days after the discovery of Homer's body, a worker named Joseph Schwab, removing garbage on the first floor of the mansion, found something different. Among the newspapers and debris, something that looked like a human foot was sticking out. It was Langley. His body had been there the whole time, less than 3 meters from where Homer had been found, buried under an avalanche of his own possessions. Our search teams had passed by him dozens of times without realizing, without suspecting, that the shapeless mass of newspapers they were removing concealed the remains of the man they were looking for. The autopsy revealed the cause of death. Langley had died crushed and asphyxiated by one of his own traps. While navigating through one of the garbage tunnels, probably carrying food toward Homer, he had tripped on a wire that he himself had stretched. The pile of newspapers above his head, precariously balanced as a defense against intruders, had collapsed on him. He had been trapped face down, unable to move, unable to scream, unable to free himself from the weight of thousands of newspapers crushing him against the floor. He had died slowly, of asphyxiation, buried alive by the very things he had spent years accumulating. The forensic experts estimated that Langley had died approximately a month before Homer, which meant something extraordinary and terrible. Homer, blind and paralyzed, had spent his last weeks of life completely alone, without food, because Langley could no longer bring it to him, without water, because Langley could no longer bring it up from the well, without any way to call for help, because the windows were boarded and the doors sealed, and no one in the outside world knew or cared about what was happening inside that house. He had died of hunger, slowly, painfully, perhaps calling out to a brother who lay dead a few meters away, not knowing that his cries fell on ears that could no longer hear. The revelation shook New York, the entire country, the entire world. Here was a tragedy that surpassed any Gothic fiction, a domestic horror of unimaginable proportions. The news of what happened in the Collyer mansion spread like wildfire through the media of the time. New York newspapers, and then those across the country, devoted entire pages to covering the story. Radios interrupted their regular programming to give updates on the findings in the house. Illustrated magazines published photographs of the mountains of garbage being removed by workers in masks. Headlines competed to be the most sensational. House of Horrors in Harlem. Brothers buried alive in their own garbage. The mystery of the hermits of 128th Street. Each day brought new revelations about what the cleaning crews had found, each object stranger than the last, each detail more macabre than the previous. The public was equally fascinated and horrified. The Collyer story touched something deep in the American psyche. The fear of isolation, of madness, of the possibility that anyone could get lost in that way if the circumstances were right. Here were two men who had had every advantage, education, money, social position, and yet they had ended up buried in garbage, dead in the most lonely and pathetic way imaginable. How was it possible? What had failed? And could it happen to anyone? These questions hung in the air while the trucks continued to haul garbage from the Collyer mansion, day after day, week after week. The final inventory of what was found in the house was astonishing in its variety and volume. 130 tons of objects were extracted from the property. 130 tons of newspapers, books, furniture, musical instruments, machine parts, weapons, clothing, tools, and thousands of other objects that defied any categorization. Among the most notable findings were 14 grand pianos, including a concert Steinway that had once been worth a fortune, a 1920 Ford Model T car, completely disassembled and stored piece by piece in different rooms, a church-sized pipe organ, dozens of violins, some of them valuable instruments, more than 25,000 books, many of them rare and valuable first editions, hundreds of meters of unused fabric, tons of coal stored in the basement, a weapons collection that included Civil War muskets and antique sabers, medical equipment that had belonged to the father, clocks of all kinds, from pocket watches to wall clocks the size of a wardrobe, bicycles, tricycles, baby carriages, sewing machines, both manual and electric, gramophones and vinyl records, a fully functional X-ray machine, and newspapers. Above all, newspapers. Decades of newspapers. Millions of pages of news about events that no one remembered anymore. About people who had died long ago. About a world that had irreversibly changed, while the Collyer Brothers remained locked in their time capsule. The oldest newspapers dated from the 1890s, before the brothers were even born. The most recent were from the weeks before Langley's death, proof that he had continued his night expeditions almost to the end. What was all of that worth? The appraisers who examined the recovered objects estimated that, in total, the Collyers' possessions could have been worth several $100,000 if they had been sold under normal conditions. But decades of moisture, rats, and neglect had reduced almost everything to worthless junk. The pianos were destroyed by termites, the books were rotted by moisture, the instruments were rusted beyond any repair. Most of what was extracted went straight to the landfill. A few objects were preserved as curiosities, donated to museums, or sold to morbid collectors. The rest was destroyed, incinerated, eliminated from the face of the earth, as if it had never existed. The mansion on 128th Street was demolished in the summer of 1947. The structure had been so weakened by the extraction of its contents that authorities determined it was a public hazard. Demolition crews tore it down in a matter of days, reducing to rubble what had been the Collyers' home for more than half a century. In its place, the city of New York built a small park, a modest green space, with some benches, some trees, a play area for children. They called it Collyer Brothers Park, though over the years the name would change to simply a number, perhaps trying to erase the association with the tragedy that had occurred in that place. But the oldest neighbors still remember. They still call that place the Crazy Brothers Park, the place where the ghosts lived, the involuntary memorial to two men who got lost in the darkness of their own minds. The Collyer Brothers case had repercussions that went beyond the initial media sensationalism. On a legal level, the case exposed the limitations of existing laws for intervening in situations of extreme self-neglect. The municipal officials who had tried to act over the years had always encountered the same obstacle. The Collyer brothers were adults. They were owners of their property. They had not committed any obvious crime. Without a specific court order, without a formal complaint of abuse, without concrete evidence that someone was in danger, the authorities lacked legal tools to intervene. After the case, the New York City Council passed what became informally known as the Collyer Law, a series of regulations that allowed city inspectors to intervene in cases of extreme garbage accumulation that represented a danger to public health. The law gave officials the authority to enter private properties, order forced cleanup, and even hospitalize people who were considered incapable of caring for themselves. It was an important step, though it came too late for Homer and Langley. And as subsequent years would show, the existence of laws does not guarantee their effective enforcement. Cases similar to the Collyers would continue to occur in New York and in cities around the world, despite the new regulations. On a medical and psychological level, the Collyer case became a reference point for the study of what we now know as compulsive hoarding disorder. Psychiatrists of the time, working with the limited tools they had, tried to analyze what had led Langley Collyer to behave that way. The theories were varied. Some pointed to extreme obsessive-compulsive disorder, exacerbated by decades of isolation. Others saw symptoms of paranoid personality disorder in Langley's pathological distrust of the outside world. Some speculated about possible brain damage caused by malnutrition or exposure to toxic substances in the house, and the truth probably combined elements of all these theories. The Collyer brothers were complex cases, people whose psychopathology had developed over decades of isolation and mutual reinforcement. They could not be reduced to a single diagnosis, a single simple explanation. What was clear was that extreme hoarding, far from being a simple eccentricity, was a symptom of deep psychological problems that required professional intervention. The term Collyer syndrome began to be used in medical circles to describe cases of pathological hoarding combined with severe self-neglect, usually in elderly people living alone. Decades later, in 2013, hoarding disorder would be officially recognized as an independent diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM-5. The diagnostic criteria included persistent difficulty in discarding possessions, significant distress associated with discarding, and accumulation that compromised the normal use of living spaces. The Collyer brothers, without knowing it, had given a name to a condition that affects millions of people around the world. But beyond the legal and medical aspects, the Collyer case raised deeper questions about the society that had allowed that tragedy to happen. How was it possible for two people to live in those conditions for decades without anyone effectively intervening? How was it possible for neighbors, authorities, and social services to have failed so completely in protecting people who were clearly in danger? The answers were uncomfortable, because they pointed to systemic failures that went beyond the individual case of the Collyers. Neighbors had noticed the warning signs for years. They had seen the boarded windows, smelled the strange odors, heard the rumors about the Hermit brothers. But they had chosen not to get involved. It was easier to cross the street, look away, tell themselves it was not their business. After all, the Collyers were strange people who clearly did not want to be bothered. Who was anyone to impose on their lives? Authorities had received multiple complaints over the years. They had visited the property on several occasions, but each time they had encountered the same barrier. The privacy of citizens was sacred, and without concrete evidence of a crime, there was no justification for intervention. Officials followed procedures, checked the appropriate boxes on their forms, and left satisfied that they had done their duty. Social services of the era were practically non-existent for cases like the Collyers. There were no specialized teams for intervention with isolated people. There were no protocols for assessing the self-care capacity of adults living alone. There were no community support networks that could have detected the problems before they became irreversible. And there was also, it must be said, an element of classism and racism in the neglect. The Collyers were two elderly white men from a good family, living in a neighborhood that had become predominantly black. Authorities saw them as an anomaly, a relic from a past era, people who did not fit the usual categories of at-risk people. The poor might need help. Immigrants might need help. But the Collyers were educated people of their own class. Surely they could take care of themselves. This combination of factors, the indifference of neighbors, the bureaucratic rigidity of authorities, the insufficiency of social services, the classism of a society that could not imagine that people like them might need help, created the perfect conditions for tragedy. The Collyer brothers were not murdered by a criminal. They were murdered by silence, by apathy, by the convenience of looking the other way when confronting reality would have been too uncomfortable. And in that, perhaps, lies the most important lesson of their tragic history. There is an image that persists in the mind of anyone who studies the Collyer case. It is the image of Homer in his armchair, blind, paralyzed, waiting, and waiting for days that he could not count, because the darkness of his blindness did not distinguish day from night. Waiting for Langley to return with food, with water, with the oranges that were supposedly going to cure him. Waiting while his body was slowly consumed, while hunger and thirst did their inexorable work. What did he think about during those endless hours? Did he remember the days of his youth, when he could see, when he could walk, when the world was full of possibilities? Did he think about the legal cases he had handled in his youth, the maritime contracts he had analyzed with such precision? Or was his mind, weakened by malnutrition and isolation, no longer capable of coherent thoughts? We do not know. We cannot know. Those thoughts died with him, in that room full of shadows, while surrounded by things he could no longer see, and that were of no use to him. What we do know is that his death was slow. Forensic experts estimated that it took him days, possibly weeks, to die after Langley stopped bringing him food. The human body is more resilient than we think, especially to starvation. It can survive weeks without food if it has access to water. It can survive days even without water, though those days are filled with indescribable suffering. Homer experienced all of that, alone, in the darkness. With no one to explain what was happening, no one to hold his hand, no one to tell him he was not alone, even though he was. It is a terrible image, an image that confronts us with the fragility of human existence, with how easy it is to go from a life of privilege to a death of absolute misery. The Collyer brothers had every advantage. They were born into a wealthy family. They received the best education available. They had opportunities that most people of their era could not even dream of. And yet, they ended up like this. One crushed under mountains of old newspapers, the other dying of hunger a few meters away, calling out to a brother who would never answer. What failed? Where did the path twist? Was there a specific moment when everything could have been different? A decision that, made differently, would have changed the fate of both? There were probably many such moments. The first time Langley decided to save an old newspaper instead of throwing it away. The first time the brothers declined a social invitation to stay home. The first time they decided to ignore a doctor's advice, because Langley believed he knew better. Each of those small decisions, seemingly insignificant at the time, was one more step toward the abyss. Isolation does not happen all at once. It is a gradual, almost imperceptible process that advances day by day, decision by decision, until one day you look around and realize you are completely alone and no longer know how to return. The Collyer brothers traveled that path for decades, and when they finally reached the end, when there was no turning back, no one was there to help them. That is the ultimate tragedy of their story. They did not die because no one could help them. They died because no one tried hard enough. They died because it was easier to ignore them than to confront the reality of what was happening behind those boarded windows. And that is the lesson we must take with us. The bodies of Homer and Langley Collyer were buried in Cypress Hill Cemetery in Brooklyn. For decades, their graves remained unmarked. 2 anonymous plots among thousands of others in a cemetery that stretched as far as the eye could see. There was no public funeral, no religious ceremony that is known of, no relatives who came to say goodbye, because the few distant cousins who remained had lost contact with the brothers decades before, and probably did not even know they had died until they read about it in the newspapers. The Collyers' estate was auctioned to pay the debts they had accumulated. Back taxes, utility bills never paid, the costs of demolishing the house and cleaning the lot. What remained after paying everything, which was not much, was distributed among distant relatives who barely remembered the names of the deceased. And that was all. 2 lives that had begun with such privilege, such promise, such potential, ended up reduced to an entry in municipal records, a footnote in the history of New York, a name that would be used for decades to describe a pathology. Collyer syndrome. Collyer disorder. The Collyer Brothers, as a synonym for everything that can go wrong when a person isolates themselves from the world. It is a strange, almost cruel legacy. Homer and Langley. Collyer would probably have hated the idea that their names were associated with madness and pathological hoarding. They had spent their lives trying to protect their privacy, to keep the world out of their affairs. And now, decades after their deaths, they were more famous than ever, but for all the wrong reasons. But perhaps there is something appropriate in it. Perhaps the fact that we remember the Collyers, that we study their case, that we try to learn from their tragedy, is the only way their deaths can have any meaning. Because cases like theirs continue to happen. Every year, in cities around the world, houses full of garbage are discovered with bodies buried inside. Elderly people forgotten by their families. Mentally ill people abandoned by a system that lacks the resources to help them. People who, for whatever reasons, decided to withdraw from the world and build fortresses of solitude that eventually became their tombs. Collyer syndrome did not die with Homer and Langley. It lives on, manifesting in thousands of cases each year, challenging the efforts of social workers and mental health professionals who try to reach those who have lost themselves in the darkness of their own minds. What can we do about it? How can we prevent future tragedies like that of the Collyer brothers? The answers are not easy, and there probably is not a single solution that works for all cases. But some things seem clear. We need better early detection systems, ways to identify people at risk before their isolation becomes total. This requires more connected communities, neighbors who know each other, who notice when someone disappears, who care enough to ask if something is wrong. We need better funded and more accessible social services. Teams of professionals trained to intervene in cases of extreme hoarding and self-neglect. And these services exist today in many cities, but they are often overloaded, underfunded, unable to serve everyone who needs help. We need legal frameworks that allow early intervention without violating the rights of individuals. This is a difficult balance to achieve. When is it appropriate for the state to intervene in the private life of a citizen? How much eccentricity is tolerable before it becomes danger? There are no simple answers to these questions, but we must keep looking for them. And we need, perhaps above all, greater social awareness about loneliness and isolation as public health problems. In an era of social networks and constant connectivity, it is easy to forget that millions of people live completely alone, without significant contact with other human beings, vulnerable to downward spirals that can end in tragedy. The Collyer brothers died more than 75 years ago. The world has changed enormously since then, but the human capacity for isolation, for distrust, for building walls between ourselves and others, remains intact. Every day, somewhere in the world, someone closes the curtains and decides not to open them again. Every day, someone adds one more object to a pile they can no longer control. Every day, someone moves a little further away from human contact, convinced that they are safer alone, not realizing that safety is an illusion that will eventually destroy them. What are we doing about it? In the park that bears the Collyer brothers' name, if it still bears it, Children play without knowing the history of the place. Mothers watch them from the benches, chatting among themselves about the trivialities of daily life. Old people feed the pigeons, enjoying the afternoon sun. It is a normal, peaceful scene, completely different from the nightmare that occurred in that same place decades ago. But somewhere nearby, perhaps on that same block, perhaps a few streets away, someone is sitting in a room full of accumulated objects, seeing no one, talking to no one, convinced that the world is a dangerous place from which they must protect themselves. Do we know about it? Do we care? Are we doing something about it? The Collyer brothers cannot answer these questions. They are dead, buried in unmarked graves, forgotten, except as names in textbooks and research articles. But we are still alive. We still have the opportunity to learn from their tragedy, to look around us, to reach out to those who are getting lost. The question is whether we will do it, or whether, like the neighbors of 128th Street did for decades, we will simply cross the street and keep walking. The Collyer brothers' case offers no easy answers. It only offers questions. Uncomfortable questions that we prefer not to ask ourselves, that are easier to ignore, that require of us something more than morbid curiosity or passing fascination. They require action. They require attention. They require that we look around and ask ourselves if there is someone who needs help, someone who is getting lost, someone whose absence no one has noticed. Homer and Langley Collyer are dead. Nothing can change that. Nothing can give them back the lives they lost, the decades they spent locked in their garbage prison, the opportunities they let pass while the world kept turning without them. But their story lives on, as a warning, well, as a reminder, as an uncomfortable mirror that forces us to look at our own capacity for indifference. The house on 128th Street was demolished decades ago, but houses like that still exist. People like the Collyers still exist, and the silence that surrounds them remains deafening. Some names are remembered for their achievements. Others are remembered for their tragedies. Homer and Langley Collyer are remembered for both, for what they could have been and for what they became, for the wasted potential and for the horror their lives turned into, for the questions they left unanswered and for those they forced us to ask ourselves. They are a reminder of how fragile the human mind can be, of how easy it is to get lost, of how difficult it can be to find the way back once one has begun to withdraw from the world. And they are a reminder of our responsibility toward others, that we live in community, whether we like it or not, that what happens to our neighbor, even to the strange neighbor who never leaves their house, concerns us all. The Collyer brothers died alone. They died forgotten. They died in ways that could have been prevented if someone, anyone, had decided to act. May their memory serve us to do things differently. Somewhere in some city, at this very moment, someone is closing the windows. Someone is stacking newspapers. Someone is withdrawing from the world, step by step, day by day, until the abyss becomes insurmountable. Perhaps it is time we stopped walking. Perhaps it is time we knocked on the door. On March 21st, 1947, the New York police entered a mansion full of garbage and found the remains of 2 destroyed lives. And more than 75 years later, the question remains the same. Who is disappearing now, and what are we doing about it? But beyond the questions, beyond the lessons, beyond the warnings, there remains the simple human tragedy of 2 brothers who loved each other in their own way, who tried to protect each other from a world they did not understand, and who ended up destroying each other through that very love. Langley Collyer was not a monster. He was a man who had been taught from childhood that the world was dangerous, that strangers could not be trusted, that the only safe place was home. He took those lessons to their logical extreme, building a fortress that became a prison, accumulating possessions that became weapons, caring for his brother in ways that ultimately killed them both. Was it love? In some twisted, distorted sense, yes. Langley dedicated his life to Homer. He gave up any possibility of his own happiness, his own relationships, his own future, to care for his blind and paralyzed brother. Every newspaper he saved, every object he dragged home, every trap he set, was, in his mind, an act of devotion, a way of preparing for a future where Homer would be well again. That future never came. It was never going to come. But Langley could not accept that reality. To accept it would have been to admit that everything he had done, everything he had sacrificed, had been for nothing. So he kept accumulating, kept believing, kept waiting for a cure that existed only in his imagination. Homer, for his part, was trapped long before the garbage piled up around him. His blindness and arthritis made him dependent on Langley for everything. He had no way to verify what his brother told him about the outside world. He had no way to seek help, even if he had wanted to. His reality was entirely constructed by Langley, filtered through his brother's paranoid worldview. Did Homer ever realize that something was wrong? Did he ever question Langley's methods, his obsessions, his increasingly erratic behavior? We will never know. Whatever doubts Homer may have had, he was in no position to act on them. He was a prisoner of his own body and of his brother's madness. The relationship between the Collyer brothers is a case study in codependency, in the ways that love can become pathological when it is isolated from the checks and balances that normal social interaction provides. In a healthy environment, someone would have noticed Langley's deteriorating mental state, and someone would have questioned his methods, challenged his beliefs, offered alternative perspectives. But the Collyers had no one. They had only each other, and their mutual reinforcement of unhealthy patterns led them both to destruction. This is perhaps the cruelest irony of their story. They withdrew from the world to protect themselves, and in doing so, they eliminated any possibility of being saved. The walls they built to keep danger out also kept help out. The isolation they chose as a defense became the instrument of their death. The psychology of hoarding has been extensively studied in the decades since the Collyer case. We now understand that compulsive accumulation is often related to trauma, to loss, to an attempt to fill emotional voids with physical objects. The hoarder cannot bear to throw anything away because every object represents a connection, a memory, a piece of identity that feels too precious to lose. For Langley, the newspapers were more than just paper and ink. They were a promise, a hope, a tangible representation of the future he believed was possible. Throwing them away would have meant admitting that Homer would never read them, that the cure would never come, that all his efforts had been in vain. So he kept them, adding more each day, building mountains of hope that eventually buried him. There is something profoundly sad about this image. A man so desperate to save his brother that he could not see he was killing them both. A man so committed to his delusion that he literally died for it. A man who, in his own twisted way, loved too much and too blindly. But sadness is not enough. Understanding is not enough. If we only feel sorry for the Collyers without learning from their tragedy, then their deaths truly were meaningless. The lesson of the Collyer brothers is not just about hoarding, or about mental illness, or about the failures of social services. It is about the fundamental human need for connection, for community, for relationship with others. It is about what happens when that need is denied, when people withdraw into themselves and shut the door on the world. We are social creatures. We need each other not just for practical reasons, for food and shelter and protection, but for something deeper. We need others to reflect back to us who we are, to challenge our assumptions, to keep us anchored in reality. Without that reflection, without those challenges, we can drift into delusion without ever knowing it. The Colliers had no one to tell them that what they were doing was not normal. They had no one to suggest that there might be another way. They had only each other, and their shared reality became increasingly disconnected from the reality everyone else inhabited. This is why isolation is so dangerous. Not just because isolated people may not receive help when they need it, but because isolation itself distorts perception, warps judgment, makes the abnormal seem normal. The Colliers did not think they were living in garbage. They thought they were living in a carefully organized collection of valuable objects. They did not think they were dying. They thought they were surviving, protecting themselves, preparing for a better future. Oh, this distortion of reality is perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Collyer case. It suggests that any of us, under the right circumstances, could lose our grip on reality without even knowing it. It suggests that the line between sanity and madness is thinner than we like to believe, and that crossing it can happen so gradually that we never notice we have crossed. This is why we need each other. This is why community matters. This is why we cannot simply walk past the boarded windows and pretend that what happens inside is none of our business. The Collyer Brothers are a warning. They are a warning about what happens when we let people disappear. They are a warning about the cost of indifference. They are a warning about the fragility of the human mind and the dangers of isolation. But they are also a reminder that every person, no matter how strange or difficult or withdrawn, deserves connection. A reminder that reaching out to others is not just an act of charity, but an act of survival, both for them and for ourselves. A reminder that the walls we build to protect ourselves can become the walls that imprison us. Somewhere in the world, right now, someone is building those walls. Someone is adding another newspaper to the pile, closing another curtain, taking another step away from the human community that could save them. The question is not whether such people exist. They do. They always have, and they always will. The question is what we will do about it. Will we walk past, as the neighbors of 128th Street did for decades? Or will we stop and look and reach out a hand? The Collyer Brothers cannot be saved, but others can. And every time we choose connection over indifference, every time we choose to see rather than to look away, we honor their memory in the only way that matters, not with monuments or plaques or parks named after them, but with action, with attention, with the simple human act of caring about what happens to our neighbors. That is the legacy of Homer and Langley Collyer. That is what their tragic deaths can teach us if we are willing to learn. The house on 128th Street is gone. The brothers are buried and forgotten. But the choice they present us with remains. What will we choose? In the end, the story of the Collyer Brothers is not really about two eccentric men who filled their house with junk. It is about all of us. It is about the choices we make every day, the connections we maintain or abandon, the people we notice or ignore. Every community has its own Colliers. Every neighborhood has a house with closed curtains, a person who is never seen, a life that is slowly disappearing behind walls of silence and neglect. The question is whether we will notice before it is too late, whether we will act before another tragedy unfolds, whether we will learn from the past or simply repeat it. The brownstone mansion on the corner of 5th Avenue and 128th Street no longer exists. In its place stands a modest park where children play and old people rest. Most of them do not know the history of the ground beneath their feet. Most of them have never heard of Homer and Langley Collyer. But the earth remembers, and we should remember too, because forgetting the Colliers means forgetting the lesson their deaths taught us. And that lesson is simple, although not easy. We are responsible for each other. We cannot save everyone. We cannot force people to accept help they do not want. We cannot break down every door behind which someone is suffering. But we can pay attention. We can notice when someone disappears. We can reach out, even when it is awkward, even when it is unwelcome, even when it seems like none of our business. Because it is our business. Because we are all connected. Because the wall that separates one person from the rest of humanity diminishes all of us. Homer and Langley. Collyer died alone, surrounded by tons of garbage, forgotten by a world that had stopped caring about them long before their hearts stopped beating. Let their memory be a call to action. Let their tragedy be the last of its kind. Let us, finally, learn to knock on the door. March 21st, 1947. A cold day in Harlem. A smell that could no longer be ignored. A door that was finally forced open. And behind that door, the answer to a question no one had thought to ask. What happens to those we choose not to see? Now we know. The question is what we will do with that knowledge. The Collyer brothers are waiting for an answer. So is everyone else who is disappearing right now, behind closed doors and boarded windows, in cities and towns all over the world. They are waiting for someone to notice. They are waiting for someone to care. They are waiting for someone to knock. Will it be you? The silence of 128th Street lasted for decades. It was the silence of a neighborhood that had learned to look away, of authorities that had learned to follow procedures rather than instincts, of a society that had learned to value privacy over protection. That silence killed Homer and Langley Collyer as surely as the starvation and the collapsed newspapers. And that same silence continues today, in different houses, on different streets, in different cities. It is the silence that surrounds the elderly woman who has not been seen in weeks, the silence that hangs over the house with the overgrown lawn and the mail piling up, the silence that follows the neighbor who stopped answering the door. We have a choice. We can maintain that silence, as the neighbors of 128th Street did. We can tell ourselves that it is not our business, that people have a right to privacy, that someone else will surely do something. Or we can break it, and we can ask the question that no one asked about the Colliers until it was far too late. Is everyone all right in there? That question, asked early enough, could have saved Homer and Langley. That question, asked today, could save someone else. It is such a simple thing, such a small act of human connection, and yet it is the one thing that was missing from the Collyer story, the one thing that might have made all the difference. No one asked if they were all right. No one knocked on the door with genuine concern, rather than official duty. No one saw them as people rather than problems. And so they died, alone and forgotten, in a house full of things, but empty of love. Let us not make the same mistake. Let us ask the question. Let us knock on the door. Let us see each other, truly see each other, before it is too late. That is what the Collyer brothers would want, if they could speak to us now. That is the only monument that matters. Not a park, not a plaque, not a name in a medical textbook, just the simple act of caring about what happens to our neighbors, just the willingness to break the silence, just the courage to knock.